And welcome to the live stream wherever you are in the world. If you're in New Zealand, congrats. What a win for Ryan Fox. If you're in Spain, wow, the World Cup. Even I was a little bit excited about that, but I shouldn't go on about it because Mark's English, of course. But there you go. Mark Slade, the our guest on the show again today, and we're going to learn a lot from him, no doubt about that at all. But first of all, big welcome to you wherever you are in the world. Don't forget you can join us on live on YouTube chat with your questions and comments. Looking forward to having those. No doubt there'll be lots of talk about Spa and what we saw there or didn't see at Spa, and obviously this weekend, second part of the doubleheader, going into the Hungarian Grand Prix. And as you may have noticed just at the beginning there with the intro, the reference to Ferenc Šiš, who a young Hungarian who believed in his own talent and decided to go motor racing when cars had barely been invented, got a job at the Renault factory as a mechanic, worked on the factory floor, persuaded his bosses to give him a chance to do a bit of testing, and went out and won the 1906 French Grand Prix, as it happened, the first ever proper Grand Prix. Can't call it Formula One, but first ever Grand Prix. So big shout out to Ferenc Šiš and everything he did for Hungary. He was a Hungarian, and it's impossible really to walk into the Hungaroring without seeing the sculpture celebrating his career and his life. So just wanted to say that. Good stuff. So with no more ado, I'd like to introduce to our show the inimitable Mark Slade. Mark, good to see you.
Hello, Peter. How you doing, everybody?
Yeah, I think everybody's well. And what were your thoughts in general about the Belgian Grand Prix? We haven't really spoken to you since Spa.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty disappointing, similar to Suzuka early in the year, Silverstone to some extent. There was just so much going on that wasn't understandable. There were so many drivers and cars whose performance was being influenced by factors we didn't understand, that I just felt that although I think Kimi Antonelli thoroughly deserved to win the race, he did a fantastic job over the weekend, but there were just too many things that I didn't work and get that were going on that affected it in a big way. And I just don't think it's appropriate. It's not what we should be watching.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that sentiment, Mark. And you and I have chatted quite a lot about what we saw on the opening straight on the first lap of the race. And as the dust is kind of settling, it's interesting to see Andrew Shovlin at Mercedes talking about, we got to get on top of this, and George had some weird issues, and maybe some other Mercedes runners did. But to me, it's bizarre because Kimi Antonelli was actually slower on the straight than George. So George, what's he complaining about? But he would be complaining if he looked at the speed of the McLarens, who were really quick, as indeed were the Williams with Mercedes power, and the Alpines, obviously, really quick. So, how does that? Everybody seems to be at a loss, really. Is that fair comment, do you think? Or do you think that we're missing something?
I think everyone is at a loss, including the teams themselves. Mercedes have made comments that all of their cars were affected to some degree or other by a loss of boost come the top of the before the Kemmel Straight. It's really coloured by the fact that obviously you get a massive speed variation depending on what the toe quality is that cars are getting from each other. So the guy at the front is always going to be the slowest, and then it's going to sort of gradually, cars will pick up speed further behind as there are more cars in front of them, they're closer to the cars ahead. But it doesn't explain what we actually saw. And we got George saying he had literally no boost at all when he got to the top of the hill after Eau Rouge. And it seems that Kimi had maybe some boost. And then you look at this, as you say, the speeds of the McLarens in particular were very high. We had Lando Norris was doing 3:38 as he came over the brow. Pierre Gasly's doing 3:42. And those cars actually pick up speed to the end of the straight, whereas you got Kimi dropping from 3:17 to 3:08. And George, by contrast, starts at 3:08 and goes up to 3:16. So it's just so bizarre. I don't know what's going on. And it has a big effect.
Yeah, it does. And let me ask you this, Mark. Maybe I've been missing something here as well, but I was a little bit perplexed by the use of the word boost. I mean, what are they referring to there? They're not referring to turbo boost. They're referring to electrical boost, aren't they? I guess.
Well, I think they just use a button which is called boost, and it does a number of things. But one of the things it would have done there is avoid super clipping and use the available electrical energy to increase power down that part of the straight. So they're calling it boost, but there are times when it does different things. You know, you can not use electrical power, but not do super clipping, so you get some benefit. So there's a number of different factors, but they're basically using what's electrical power that is on board within the standard modes. So you can't use the overtaking mode on the first lap. So you're not getting the extra speed above. Trying to remember the speed now. 300. I can't remember. It's around 300 k's, isn't it? Where the speed starts, the electrical power input starts to decline. So that was still happening, but some cars would have had less power than others, even up to that speed. So it's just a question of how they use the available power under normal circumstances. And avoiding super clipping would obviously increase your speed towards the end of the straight. So that's what they're doing. It's just manipulating it within the existing regulation or within what they're allowed to do.
But how do we explain the speed of Charles Leclerc on the first lap on the straight there, and then 6 laps later, Max just blasts past him, and it's not Max going a lot quicker; it's just Charles suddenly going much slower on the straight there.
Well, I guess on the first lap, the Ferrari obviously did have all the energy that it was meant to have at the top of the hill, so Charles was able to use it to the maximum and was getting good toes from the cars ahead. On the later lap, when Max goes past him, I'm guessing, I can't remember the circumstances, but I'm assuming that Max had overtake mode and Charles didn't. So, and probably Charles had used what electrical power he had earlier in that lap up to turn one or down the hill, and as such had less power than available. So the differential between the two would have been quite significant in the opposite direction. So that
I get that. I get Max having the overtake, but Charles is going much slower on that lap compared to the first lap. And surely I would have thought you'd be struggling to use too much power out of turn one down the hill through Eau Rouge there. I know Max said there was too much coming out and therefore he lost a bit on the straight, but for Ferrari to be so much slower on lap 6 on the straight than they were on lap 1 on a straight that's very near the start of the lap seems very odd to me. And I still come back to wondering whether they're doing anything trick on the formation laps which gives them an advantage over other teams.
I doubt it personally. I think it's a question of toes and energy usage. Maybe he finished the previous lap with insufficient energy left, because just because the rules say you can recover a certain amount, it doesn't mean you're going to have that available if you haven't recovered it. So without access to the sort of information that would tell you what's going on, it's impossible to speculate. But I would be surprised if it's anything other than that. Personally, I don't see what else they could be doing other than on the formation lap, they've just made sure they have got full power available and it's been deployed effectively on that first lap down to Lake Coombe, and the other cars haven't. So I think we had a similar problem in Australia, didn't we, where some cars left the grid, and that was because of the position of the timing line and things that people hadn't taken into account, where I think the back half of the grid didn't have any power and the front half did, because they hadn't taken that into account, which was pretty basic.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see that, Mark, but Sarosh is basically agreeing with everything we're just saying, and I've put it up because he says both Leclerc and Max didn't know as to why their car was so fast and slow, respectively, on the first lap. They were asking on the radio why this was.
Yeah.
It's a terrible situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just complete nonsense. And what surprises me is that we aren't having more accidents caused by drivers arriving at corners at speeds they're not expecting. Yeah. You know, if you arrive at a corner doing 20 k's more, and you're able to brake and get around the corner, then it suggests that when your car was slower, you should have been going faster. Maybe, I don't know. But
yeah, I mean that's a good point. But I mean, but also the whole speed differential thing. I think we're lucky so far not to have had a major incident because of the speed differentials on the straight. It's frightening how quick some cars are and how slow some are on circuits with long straights immediately after the start. And that's, you know, and that it will be happening again. There are plenty of circuits still with that layout.
Mexico.
Yeah.
But think of that when you've got that tight corner at the end of a very, very long straight. I mean, that's going to be chaos, isn't it? Potentially. Yeah, it's a mess. But it's the lack of understanding. I think if we knew what was happening, it wouldn't be half as bad. We'd at least say, oh, that's because of this and that's because of that. But it's because we, and it seems the teams, don't even know what's going on that makes it so ridiculous. And the drivers are just being hung out to dry, as George was in that race. I mean, I did feel desperately sorry for him because I don't do all the time, to get me wrong. It's not because he's British or anything, but just because he's competing, it appeared, with two hands tied behind his back, whereas maybe Kimi only had one hand tied behind his back in that situation, and not because of anything the team's done on purpose, but because they don't understand what's going on. And George's performance at Spa wasn't as bad as it looked. But even in qualifying, there's something going on. His straight line speed in his quali run in Sector 2 was way down on Kimi's. And he was losing, can't remember what we talked about. It was in the region of quarter of a second just in Sector 2 for reasons that weren't apparent. I mean, he was doing some of the corners better than Kimi, some of them not quite so good. I think at most he should have been 2/10 behind him in qualifying, but it turned out he was 6/10 slower or something ridiculous, and that just didn't reflect the actual performance of George versus Kimi. So it's just nonsense.
But the point is, Mercedes have all the telemetry and all the data they need in order to rectify that, and yet they can't. So they obviously don't know, and George certainly doesn't know. And so there we are. There we sit, and it's a ridiculous situation. I thought it was interesting that George is beginning to say, "Well, I need perhaps to look at my driving style," but then he kind of corrected that halfway through Spa and said, "No, it's not me. It's got to be the car." Anyway, that's a subject that will go on and on, I think. But just on the question of inaccuracies, I just wanted to throw a curveball in here, which is Alice, who's a great guy, does all our stats that we use after the last day of the weekend at any Grand Prix. You see the special Alice Noski. You see the wonderful stats he comes up with, completely, you know, different to anybody else, which is why we do it, of course, because it's always nice to be different. And he's pointed out the following anomalies, Mark, and I want to get your input on this. This is the Austrian Grand Prix FIA official summing up of the race. Okay, the lap length 4.326, and that's pretty precise. Look at circuit changes. The opening at turn 1 on the right hand side has been closed, blah 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 blah, and then you see the lap distance. And if you multiply 4.326 by 71 laps, as I have, it comes out at 307.146. Now look at the bottom. They say the race distance there was 307.026, and that's not the end of it. Look at the race just passed at Spa. Exactly the same thing. If you multiply their lap length by the number of laps of the race, 308.176, and yet their total is 054. Now, you're a championship-winning race engineer. Explain what's going on there, Mark.
I think they're just a bit slack, to be honest. And these sorts of mistakes, whilst they're not every event in terms of as basic as that, it was certainly the case that mistakes were made, and we'd point them out to our team manager and he'd go down to the FA and there'd be an updated document issued. But there's lots of things like that, things that aren't clear, and you go out. Some of them, you clearly, you know, it's fair that maybe the FIA guys wouldn't have understood that something was critical, and so we have a chat with them and they then make a correction that's good. Sometimes there were things that just shouldn't have happened. I mean, that list of changes to the circuit, I mean, it's not gospel. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it isn't. We'd noticed that things that were listed sometimes weren't actually there. Sometimes what they said had happened wasn't actually quite what had happened. And sometimes there were things changed that weren't in the list. I think I got the impression that there just wasn't actually enough support for the guys from the FA at the track. That they didn't have enough support. They didn't have enough resources. They were expected to be doing too much in too little time. So my beef isn't really with them. I think it's just the overall standard that the FIA is working to, for whatever reason, is not high enough, and that the teams are expected to work to a higher standard. So, as you pointed out before, team makes a small mistake with a car setup and they get hammered, and to some extent rightly so, because the rules are the rules, and if you don't stick to the rules, there's got to be consequences. But it isn't right that the FIA are able to make mistakes and get away with them. I still think the Monaco situation with that pit lane speed limit was an absolute joke, and will have consequences at the end of the season in terms of championship positions potentially. And it's just not acceptable. They should be working to a higher standard.
Yeah,
it's as simple as that.
Yeah,
it's just not good enough.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And it's, yeah, and as you say, the guys on the ground, you always have to feel sorry for them, because they got all these teams and all the great people working for the teams that basically they're up against. But at the same time, when it comes down to things that are in your control, like lap length, race distance length, it's a little unsettling if they can't even get that accurate. I think that is the point. And anyway, what is causing that inaccuracy? Is it just sheer neglect, or bad mathematics, in other words, or is it because they have made a change that they haven't talked about on their data?
I suspect that it's the person in the graphics department who produces the map hasn't been told some change has been made, or has been told about some changes and not others, and they've put out that graphic and it's not correct. But it means that you don't have a lot of faith in other stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So
that's the upshot.
And most of the time, I suspect the information that really matters is correct. Sometimes things like this are not correct, but we have had occasions where things that really do matter, like the speed limit in Monaco, haven't been correct. So they just need to get on top of it and do a better job, because it's what controversial decisions are part of sport, you could say. But sometimes I think the standard of decision making isn't great, and the inconsistency of having different stewards from one event to another is part of that problem. But they think it's not acceptable. They just need to do a more professional, better job. This is a multi-billion-dollar business now.
Yeah.
And having basic mistakes made is just wrong, and they just need to put more effort into it, really.
Another good point from Sarosh, I think. I'll let you take this one, Mark. It's about Prost and Kimi Antonelli having quite a lot in common, and the way Kimi just went on to win at the slowest possible speed, having done the pass. And I would agree with him on that. I think Kimi looked really good in the last phase of the race, and he timed his pass on Charles really well, and used the power really well to do the pass in a way that didn't put him in jeopardy. I don't know, your thoughts on how good Kimi's now becoming?
Yeah, it's funny. I've thought of similarities between Kimi's style and Alain Prost's style previously. He's sort of undramatically super fast, isn't he? He's just like a sort of a ninja. He does everything at a superb level, and quietly gets on with it. Doesn't seem to be remotely phased at the moment. There was a time earlier in the year, wasn't there, when Bono was having to sort of get him to calm down about things. I think it was to do with team orders, wasn't it? Was that in that was in Montreal, I think, wasn't it? That's the only time really we've seen any sort of hint of Kimi getting a bit flustered. And I have to say, I don't actually remember any time that I saw Alain Prost get flustered in the car, but I guess that's because we didn't actually have radio available back then. But his
Sorry about that. I was seeing if I could move a scene down out of without it showing on screen, but it did. Sorry, I interrupted you there, Mark. Very sorry.
Yeah, but I find his driving it's just really appealing, isn't it, in terms of how smooth, precise, clean he is. It's just fantastic to see.
Yeah.
And the lack of histrionics, other than, as I said, in Montreal, he got a little bit bratty, didn't he? And I thought he needed to keep that under control. Because, and I think Bono did a great job of calming him down, and hopefully he learns from that, because it doesn't actually help him in any way. It actually rattled him on that occasion and made the situation more difficult. So
Yeah.
I'm just super impressed. And I wasn't an Alain Prost fan initially, purely because when I was a kid, I was more of a sort of Williams fan. But as I grew up, shall we say, I came to appreciate what a fantastic performance Alain Prost used to put on. And I've always been a little bit saddened by some of the stuff that's come out in hindsight with regard to him and Senna, because I think mostly it's been incredibly unfair on Alain Prost. And I just think he's a fantastic guy. Have had the pleasure of working with him briefly, both at McLaren and Renault, and he's just very, very high in my regard, because he's just a super nice guy who was one of the most talented guys we've ever seen in the sport. So for Kimi to come close to that is quite remarkable, and it shows. I think it just demonstrates how good Kimi really is, that we can think of him in those terms.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Mark, yesterday or on Monday, had a bit of a discussion with, well, actually, Cameron was quoting the FIA president saying that he wanted to go back to V8s, and he also wanted to bring back refueling, because the V8s, if they did go back to V8s, they would be heavier than the current cars, and it would be important for them to start with a lighter weight, and therefore to bring back refueling. And I raised the question with Cam. I said, I find that hard to believe. I'd be interested to get your input on this, that a V8 would be, even with a full fuel load, would be heavier than a current Grand Prix car. And at this point, I should just say that we've had a very good text from Theodoricus on YouTube community, which we're using a lot now, effectively as our social media platform. So please, anybody that wants to pass on information like this or concepts, please do so. It's a really good thing to do. Anyway, Theodore says, current Grand Prix car 26 Formula One, 768 plus 100 kilo fuel, 868 kilos. Oof, it's unbelievably heavy, isn't it? And then he's sending a V8, take 150 kilos of fuel, 792. Which bears out what we were saying. It would be lighter, especially if you take into account all the stuff that comes in with the current car, the MGUK, the battery, massive cooling hardware, etc. So I just want to get your take on that, and also what your thoughts are on refueling.
Yeah, I tend to agree that I don't see how the car could be heavier once you've taken the battery, the turbos, the MGUK. If we're going completely stripped down, yeah, I find it very difficult to believe that they would be heavier at race start, even with the extra fuel on board. So that seems a bit of a strange thing to say. However, I actually think going back to refueling would be great, because the cars would be even lighter at the race start, which I think, and on average through the race. Oh, sorry, not on average through the race, but generally they would be lighter. And it would add an extra element to the strategy, which I think is a bit lacking at the moment, where it's entirely dependent on tyres. So I think it would be fantastic to go back to refueling, but I would be surprised if that is something that is done in the current climate. But yeah, hopefully we will see it. I mean, I've said before, I'm a fan of IndyCar racing, and they do refueling there, and I think that really adds interest to those events in a great way. Makes it much more unpredictable. It depends how you do it. There's other things would have to change as well, but yeah, I'm all for it personally.
You say the current climate. What you mean by that is the powers that be wouldn't want to see the Formula One cars drinking fuel, right?
Yeah,
that's the real problem.
The fact that you are adding petrol to cars in races is obviously highlighting that dependence on fossil fuel, even if you make it more sustainable fuel. And I get the impression in the current climate that even the fuel companies aren't keen on publicising that. They'd rather you think that they were building wind turbines and things, which obviously they might be doing a little bit, but not very much. So it just doesn't seem to be very fashionable to highlight that element in racing at the moment in F1. But I think it would be much better if we just admitted the truth and got on with it, and it would make for better racing. I mean, the fact is that the fuel used by the fans getting to the events is a far greater problem than the fuel used by the cars as they're going around providing a sporting spectacle. But it's the fact that it's so prominent is the problem, isn't it? Rather than the realities.
Yeah, I mean, here's an opposite opinion, basically, to what we've just been talking about, Mark, in everything. Why are we so critical about power delivery and trying to look at the race based on the previous years? Let them figure out these issues, at least in the first session of the biggest power change, the first year, I think you mean. Yeah, well, obviously we can all do that, and there's no doubt about that. The question is, they've had a long time to think about these regulations. It's not as if they just, thought about it overnight and brought them in for 2026. They had 2, if not 3 years of gestation. And it also brings to light the topic of conversation that is critical, A, to the Formula One business and to the fans, which is, what is Formula One? Is it a show? Is it a business? Or is it a technical exercise? Now, a lot of people would argue that it's a combination of all three, but it depends on where you're sitting, really, on how you view the sport. And if you want to have a show and you want to try to have a 2021 type world championship every year, then it's pretty clear that the last thing you would do is change the technical regulations so radically that, with the teams even saying, if you do this, there's going to be a problem, that you still go ahead and do it just because you want to look after the business side of Formula One, which is to make sure you've got Audi and Cadillac and you've got the big manufacturers happy that they're in a formula that works around their PR campaigns. And that's the problem. We don't have a formula now which allows us to have reliable cars, understandable cars, producing very, very close racing. And yeah, I think it's correct to say we shouldn't go on about it. And I don't think we do go on about it. I think we often talk about it, but then we always talk about the other storylines, which are Kimi versus George, Max and how he's driving that car, the Ferrari intra struggles between Lewis and Charles, and that's all good stuff. But it's such a shame we're not going to have a 2021 type world championship, because that was there for the taking had we not tinkered with Formula One too much. That would be my take. Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, for me, I think all that is true, but I would add this fact that we don't understand what's going on. To me, that's the big issue, is we don't want to have a world champion at the end of the year that is there and we don't understand why he won it and another guy didn't. That's, to me, the problem. If you had, say, a football match where suddenly, one team stopped playing and the other team were just allowed to score a few goals and then it resumed, that would be ridiculous. And it kind of feels, to obviously a much lesser degree, that's an exaggeration, but it feels like that's what's happening, is that one driver's doing his best, or some drivers are doing their best. The fact is, we don't know how it's affecting everybody. Suddenly they're having to deal with issues not of their making, or that we don't think are of their making, that slow them down suddenly. And it affects the result, and you can't talk about it because you don't know what's going on. And that, for me, is the big problem. I think, yeah, it was pretty poor the way these things were introduced when problems were being pointed out, and it's more than 3 years of gestation. Honestly, it's more like 5 years, I think. But that's one aspect. But when you simply actually don't know why one guy is on pole and another guy isn't, and you can't say, oh, it's because his car's not as good here because we know it's got less downforce, or it's not as well balanced, or he was on the wrong tyres, or he made a mistake at this corner. You can't talk about these things because we literally don't know why George's car was so slow in qualifying at Spa. We don't know why. We don't know why his car didn't accelerate at the top hill in the way that other cars did.
And more to the point, nor do Mercedes, quite clearly.
And the reason I'm focusing on George, and I know he's British and we've been accused of being pro-British, but that's not the point. The point is that a driver had a problem and it just happened to be George Russell in this particular case. There may be other drivers who also had problems that we don't know about. We know that Charles Leclerc's qualifying in Shanghai was affected by a ridiculous problem when he lifted off because he had an oversteer moment and went back on the power and it used more energy than it should have done down to the following corner. And that extra power made him quicker in that bit of the lap, but it was an inefficient place of using power. And then when he needed the power, he didn't have it. So he didn't qualify as well as he should have done. That's ridiculous. That shouldn't have happened. And I'm sure there are many, many other examples of that. And that the fact that that came out presumably is because someone in the team explained it to someone, and that's an example where they did understand what happened. But it shouldn't be happening, and there are things going on that clearly even the teams don't understand and shouldn't be happening, and it's ruining our sport because it's not the competition we want to see. So I think there's two aspects to it. There's what you've described, but there's this ridiculous, we can't even talk about it because we don't know what's going on aspect to it. It's just absolute. I was about to use a word I shouldn't use there, but it's just nonsense.
Yeah.
It's not a competition. You know, it's even worse, in my opinion, than the regulators, you know, making poor stewarding choices because then at least you know that has happened. You can hold them to account. You can talk about it. But when you don't know what the hell is actually going on with the power units, you can't talk about it other than say, well, something's going on and it's not right. It's just crazy. And it won't change next year.
And the other thing I would add is that I think it's the height of hypocrisy, actually, when team principals now start to complain about the regulations and say exactly what you've just said, Mark, or we're a customer team, we're not getting the same understanding of the software or this or that. I mean, all of this was totally predictable, even for the most casual observer of Formula One. I kind of have sympathy with the drivers because if it's circuit design, safety, maybe control issues in the car, seating, comfort in the car, all those things the drivers should be on top of, the GPDA, whatever, before they happen. But when it comes to things like the regulations, engine changes, and it involves massive amounts of money, massive changes, and it's all done at the top of the sport, the drivers at that point, you can kind of excuse them for saying, well, you know, okay, if that's what they want to do, we'll let them get on with it. They know what they're doing, sort of thing. And yet, here are the team owners now, some of them, Stella is one, I'm sure there will be others, starting to complain about these regulations. And it's much too late to do that. I mean, the teams were in a position of power to do a lot more over the last 5 years to prevent this happening. And as you've correctly said many times, Mark, you know, there are a lot of voices warning them of what could happen. But guess what? None of them actually went through, and they all let it happen ultimately. And we should remember that Formula One is very different from any other sport of the world, in that Formula One is about teams, it's about power bases, and therefore ultimately the power is with the teams. It's not with the commercial rights holder. It's not with the FIA. It is with the teams. If there's something really bad about to happen, it's up to the teams to make sure it doesn't happen. Now, of course, there are many mitigating circumstances to explain why these regulations went through, not the least of which, and you and I were chatting about this beforehand, and you made the point, it's the power unit manufacturers are dominated obviously by Mercedes, and then you've got the Ferrari, you've got the Red Bull, you've got the Audi and so forth, and the Honda. But and from a Mercedes point of view, they probably thought, nah, we'll be good here. This will be good for us. And that's how it all went through, basically. And it's, you know, I don't know. To me, that's wrong. And had Ferrari not gone along with it, and had Red Bull not gone along with it in a pretty vociferous way, I think we might be in a different position now, but we're not. And it ultimately comes, but I think it's much too late now for the team principals to start saying, oh, well, this isn't very good and that's not very good and we don't understand this. It's their own fault. You know, they should have done something about it beforehand, and they're ruining the sport by not doing that. Response?
I think the teams and engine manufacturers are culpable to a very high level. There are people within those teams demonstrating, explaining the problems that were going to occur, and they weren't listened to by the people in authority, whether that be FIA, F1, Liberty, or the senior management of teams themselves, senior management of engine manufacturing companies. Yeah, they're all culpable.
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessary. And it's very, very disappointing. And I think it largely comes down to vested interests more than anything else. But it's the ridiculousness of not appreciating that a strong sport is best for everybody, and the fact that I think they've all convinced themselves that the reason the sport is so strong now is because they're all so clever, when in fact the reason the sport is strong now is because it was a good sport when Drive to Survive broke it to a much bigger audience. And that's what made it popular. It was the sport then that that makes it popular now. Why they think they need to change things now to make it popular is because of egos and misunderstanding. Drive to Survive was started when the sport had different regulations, and that made it popular. Yeah. It's just bizarre to me that they think it's popular because of the things they've done since then, which is not true. It's just a misunderstanding, but I'm afraid it's egos and opportunism on the part of some people, inevitably.
And here's a thought. I mean, what will happen to the Drive to Survive audience? That's the right way to describe them. I'm not quite sure what that is. Hopefully, many of them have continued to watch the races, not just the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. What will happen to that audience if Kimi has secured the championship with 3 races to go and George is an easy second and everybody's kind of droning around to finish third? I mean, what will happen to that audience then?
Well, they'll have to manipulate the storylines to make other things more interesting, won't they? And I strongly suspect that the storyline that won't get promoted is the power unit variation and the strangeness and behaviour of what's going on. So be interesting to see if there's an episode next season of Drive to Survive concentrating on George's weekend in Spa and the power unit issues he encountered that affected his championship push. My feeling is that won't come up.
No, it was quite marked, was it not, when we saw, excuse the pun, but we saw, you see them going through Eau Rouge on board, and then as soon as they get to the straight, they go to the long lens shot, don't they? There's no way they sit with a car on the straight, unless it's an obvious overtake, then they might do it. But if you're actually watching the onboards and listening to the audio, it is painful. It was really painful up the Kimmel Straight, predictably so, but it was painful.
I don't know if it's true. My son told me it was the first time that a full on board of the pole position lap wasn't shown live. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is true, then that just shows how manipulated it's become.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the last time I saw a battery graphic in the main feed either.
Now, I'd love to see the battery graphics, especially on the grid, to see what those Ferraris are doing. I know I'm a kind of a lone voice there, but there's something weird going on there, I think. They're not weird, they're just doing a good job with harnessing the power, or whatever verb you want to use to describe it. Anyway, let's get this is Hossein Sakibas. Lack of testing makes the teams compelled to test in the races. They cannot perfect it in the first go. Just be patient and let the teams figure things out. You cannot set the rules and then criticize. Well, we didn't set the rules. That's why we are criticizing. It's the first point. Secondly, if they had said, well, we got these new rules, they're unbelievably complicated. We think they're going to be some major dramas with power regen and harvesting. And so therefore, we're going to bring back a lot more testing so that people can test mid-season, before the year, at the end of the year, whatever, during the August break, and they can make changes to the cars during the August break, and we're going to lift the budget cap, then I think it would all make a bit of sense. But they don't do that. They've got no testing virtually, and And well, you know the rest. And that's the problem. You know, you said lack of testing. Well, that is one of the problems. If we had a lot of testing, we wouldn't be in this situation. And this is a drum I've just got to beat because I'm never going to give up on it. I think the budget cap is a complete and utter waste of time. And it arose, and we have it purely for the reasons Mark's just been talking about, all political. It was there initially to try to help the midfield teams to become competitive. None of that has happened, predictably. The teams have always found a way around it at the top of the sport. And if it's one or the other, i.e., the teams all subjected to some sort of budget cap, which means no testing, and whatever you basically got, you're locked into, as per Aston Martin for the first half of the year, or no budget cap. The teams police their own budgets. You spend what you can afford, and the top teams are out there racing at the absolute limit, developing the car all the time, copying one another if necessary, building a completely new car in 6 and 9 months to appear back end of the year. Which would you rather? I think the fans would go for the second one. And of course, it's just like, you know, do we need hybrid engines? Do we need these engines when we could be doing everything with reusable fuel, for example? Well, emphasizing a lot more reusable fuel. We could be doing the whole carbon footprint message in a very different way in Formula One without limiting the ability of the team to do what they really well, which is build fabulous Grand Prix cars surprisingly quickly. And that can be done with a million ways. I mean, you can reduce the carbon footprint internationally with the amount of travel, the motorhomes. There's a million things you could do. But we don't. We have the budget cap, and it's supposedly there to make the racing much more competitive. And guess what? It's not. Anyway, I've had my rant on that. Mark had his head down there. I'm not sure you're even listening to that one, Mark, but
I
I've
was.
always felt that way. And while I'm at it, I would say bring back spare cars. If you're going to have lots of testing, bring back spare cars as well, because if a race is stopped at the start on the first lap, it'd be great to have the hero running in and jumping into the spare car, and also in practice as well, getting into the spare car. I'll bring it all back. I don't believe the savings are that significant relative to the amount of drama being caused by the cost cap regulations and the current technical regulations. If you weigh one up against the other, there you go. Existential argument about the future of Formula One. You're speechless.
No, no. I think I agree with a lot of what you say. I think the cost cap has brought costs down.
Yeah, yeah, of
Um,
course it has. But to
but
what
but
we could have done
but
that other ways.
yes, exactly. And testing went before the cost cap was introduced. Um, I think testing should come back, but it would have to be done in the right way. I mean, as someone who took part in it, it was an absolute killer. So there's ways of regulating it that would make it more acceptable, but I think it is a big problem. I mean, it can't, even going back to the first point of this lack of testing compelled teams to test in the races. I mean, yeah, that's why they shouldn't have introduced such a complicated new set of rules without adequate background testing. It actually confirms how ridiculous it is.
Mm.
It's like British Leyland making cars in the UK in the 70s and expecting the customers to do the testing. And look what happened there. You end up with something that's basically a bucket of crap.
Hang on,
So
I've got to stop you there, Mark. In 19, I don't know, whenever, 81 or 2, I set with four other drivers, I set 12 new British speed records in a British Leyland Rover at Snetterton, 24-hour thing. Brilliant car. It did blow up at the end from memory. And the other BL story I've got is Nigel Mansell in 79, when he was driving for Dave Price in Formula 3, a Unipart March with a Dolomite engine, a BLM engine, if you like, developed from the Triumph Dolomite. Had to do a series of road shows that year. And his road car, he was given as part of the thing. I don't know if he got a salary, but he got a road car, which is a Triumph TR7, another BL product. And on the way to one of these road shows, midweek road shows, the thing blew up, as it always did. I had a TR7, believe me, they did. And so he managed to do a very good job of running to the nearest town and getting a rental car and getting to the roadshow only 10 minutes late. And when he put in his expenses 2 weeks later for the use of the rental car, they refused to pay it, saying, no, you're not, that's not in your contract. So there you go. That's my BL adjunct to what you were just saying. Anyway,
Yeah,
I love the BL reference anyway, British Leyland.
but it's to me it's mismanagement, isn't it?
Hmm.
You know, it's the same thing. It's just a lack of understanding of what the objective actually is,
Yeah.
and doing stupid things basically, and then being surprised when it doesn't work. You know, we shouldn't be doing testing in races. I mean, a certain amount of testing is always done in races, but it shouldn't be done in races. It should have been a better package. It shouldn't have been this ropey to start with. It should have been better.
I've got to stop you
Um,
again there. But we do testing in a very controlled way, and it's called the sprint race.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah,
They get all that
uh,
testing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah. Anyway, don't start me on sprint races. Yeah. Um,
Can I start
it,
you on something else? This is again from my mate Peter Hill, top man, one of the men who's really made it possible for Rob to be, going forward with his medical situation, and also the founder of Globe, wonderful company, Australian company, Globe clothing and skateboards and everything great. Anyway, Peter Hill sent me a message saying, "Here's an idea, mate. Following on from Abu Dhabi 21, and indeed from uh, Silverstone, why don't they have a rule saying that if there's a red flag, sorry, if there's a safety car within the last 5 laps of the race, come what may, is red flagged and restarted for a 5 lap sprint with tire changes. What do you think of that? So it always finishes as a sprint race if we get into that situation. Not a sprint race, as we've referred to it before. You know what I mean by
yeah,
a
yeah,
5 lap
yeah.
dash. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think I agree to that or something. I mean, fundamentally, a race should never end under a safety car. That's just wrong. That's not the spectacle that we should be putting out. So something should be put in the rules to make sure that that doesn't happen. And that sounds like a feasible way of doing it. So I agree that we should never, ever have races ending under safety cars, unless I guess it occurs on the last lap itself, in which case it's unavoidable. But at any point prior to the last lap, you shouldn't be putting the safety car out and trundling around to the end of the race. It's just wrong. It's poor.
And what would you allow the teams to do to the car when they came in? Let's say as five, it's going to be a 5 lap sprint. What would you be allowed to do to the cars for that, do you think?
Uh, Ideally, nothing. But what they carp on about is, oh, what if a tire's damaged or what have you? And that was why teams were allowed to change tires when races are stopped. I
So we
think in
allowed tire
IndyCar,
changes then. Would you allow flap adjustment
I don't think they need to change anything. I think they just need to do a start and finish the race.
with
Um,
a new set of tires?
no, why
Well,
a new
because
set
of
of
that
tires?
problem we had. It was at
Well,
Monaco, wasn't it? With that problem with Alonso
yeah, but you've
and
stopped the race, so you've got time to look at all the tires on all the cars, and if there's one that has got a problem, then give them a dispensation to change something. But I think as a rule, they shouldn't be allowed to change tires. An IndyCar, they don't change tires, so um, I, that's why it's happened because of the so-called safety thing. But I don't think it's necessary. I think you could get away with not doing that because the trouble is, as soon as you say you can change tires, then it comes down to who's got what tires. It becomes a complete lottery. I mean, to be honest, I don't think I'm that bothered whether they change tires or not, but I don't think it's necessary. And it leads to situations like we had in 2021 in Abu Dhabi, when some people are able to change new tires and some people aren't, and it could be because someone's done a better job of the race up until that point, put themselves in the lead, and then because of that bizarre twist of fate, it gets
yeah.
taken away from them. So personally, I'd prefer it not to be a change of tires
But
or anything else.
but you could have a rule that Pirelli have to bring more soft tires, and those tires are never used unless there is that situation, 5 laps to go, within 5 laps. And then on top of that, what do you think of that idea? On top of that, would it be a standing start or a rolling start?
Uh, I would have a standing start. But then that leads to obviously incidents. Well, any sort of start does. Probably having extra tyres, then you're
Just for
carting all
that.
those. Sorry.
Just for that situation. And
Yeah,
maybe it's called the sprint tire or something, and it just goes.
yeah,
They don't have to build that many of them. They just take them from race to race.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you could do that, but it just seems a bit unnecessary to me. That's all. Carting them all around the world, and you will get some teams saying, "Oh, they would have to be replaced fairly regularly because of aging." So then Pirelli are going to want to do that because it's going to cost them a load of money. And then you're going to get, they'll replace some teams because some tires because they're old and some tires because they're maybe not so old. Or we used to have this thing with tires that were kept in containers on ships that were at the side of the container weren't as good as the tires that had been in the middle of the container because of condensation in the containers and stuff like that. So there's so many other
I'm
issues
sure
that
that's
start to
still the
come into
case,
it.
isn't it? Why would that have changed?
Yeah. So the easiest thing is just say don't change the tires. Just get rid of all that
Yeah, I don't know.
nonsense and just
To me, that's a can of worms because I can imagine one driver being very persuasive about this terrible slow puncture he's got, and they haven't got enough time really to verify it. And all of a sudden, he's got a new set of tires, and the guy next to him hasn't. I can just see that happening. I mean, this is Formula One. Let's face it.
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, yes, but as I say, in IndyCar they don't do that, and I don't recall there actually being a big issue. So somehow it seems to work for them, even if it seems like it wouldn't work in Formula One. But
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
All right. Let's move on to another question. This is Gandalf the Fool says, "Hi Peter and Mark, hope you're doing great." Yep, we are. Thank you very much indeed. And I think I speak for Mark there. Hi Peter, have a great show. Thank you. We're trying to had a few glitches behind the scenes, as you've probably seen, but these things happen. Johnny F1, can you talk about the incidents of the two Ferraris? Are we talking about Spa here, Johnny? Are we talking about? And are we talking about Lewis's thing of, you know, weird
the
not
penalties.
being told about the penalty and the penalty anyway, and then his race and how well he drove? Let's just talk about that anyway, Mark, because I think that's an important point.
Yeah, I thought ultimately, I suppose Lewis probably did deserve the penalty on the first lap because he did lose control of his car and hit George. But it was a bit of a racing incident, and again, I don't fully understand the FIA's interpretation of first lap incidents because in the past they've said they'll take they'll be easier on drivers in those sorts of circumstances, and then occasionally they're not. So, whilst I thought he probably did deserve a penalty, I don't really understand why they gave him a penalty in the context of similar things have happened before and drivers haven't got penalties. So that was odd. And then Charles not getting a penalty when he effectively, who was it? He pushed off the road.
Piastri.
Piastri, yeah. Why didn't he get a penalty for that? And it seemed to be because Piastri was able to continue, which to me is like, well, that's nonsense. The driver still drove into the other car, and you could almost say it was actually worse because he was in control of his car. But because the other driver doesn't get retired from the race, then the driver who caused the incident doesn't get a penalty. That I just don't get that. So in my view, applying the rules equitably, both Ferraris should have had penalties for that. The incident in the pit lane, the team getting a fine for nearly running a mechanic over, I think is appalling, and he should have got a bigger penalty. Because to me, it's an absolute no-no that the mechanics get hurt in pit stops. That should absolutely not be allowed to happen. And if the teams knew they were going to get a massive penalty for any incident that potentially hurt a mechanic, then they wouldn't take as many risks. So I thought that was really poor, and I thought Lewis should have been absolutely hammered, and not because it was his fault, but because it was the team's fault. So yeah, I would have applied more penalties, basically.
Good point. All good points. What did you think of the lack of communication between the mechanic doing the front flap adjustment and the pit wall.
Yeah, it's cool, and it does happen. I know it does happen, but it needs not to happen. And once it was realised that the call to adjust the front wing hadn't been made, they should have just accepted that it was a mistake and not put someone in danger. But they did put someone in danger, and I think that's really bad. Unless it was the guy suddenly thought, oh, damn, I haven't made that change that I was supposed to do, and put himself in danger, I suppose is another thing. But the fact is that he was in the mechanic who releases the car should have seen him and not released the car. So I don't understand how that happened. So fundamentally, a load of mistakes were made by Ferrari, and they should have been absolutely hammered for putting a crewman in great danger, in my opinion, to stop other people being willing to make those same calls.
Yep. Mark, what second race in a row now, it appears as if they were late in telling Lewis about the penalty. And on this occasion, it was box, and Lewis saying, why the tires are great. And then they said, well, you've got a 5-second penalty. And then it's the penny drops, and then it coincidence, obviously the VSC comes into play, which kind of worked in his favor. But what do you think about that business? We've seen it 2 races in a row now of Lewis apparently not knowing that he's got a penalty for a number of laps.
Yeah, it's surprising because you'd thought after the previous race they'd have had a discussion about what to do in those circumstances and agreed something. So maybe they agreed that they wouldn't tell him.
Yeah.
Maybe Lewis said, I don't want to know until I have to because it disturbs my race. Maybe that's what they've agreed, and that's why they've done it the same way again. And maybe they'd had that discussion beforehand as well. Prior to the previous race. So maybe that's what's going on there, that he's actually said, I don't want to know if those things happen until you actually tell me. Unless, presumably, they think that they want him to drive differently because it would affect the outcome of the race. Maybe they would tell him in those situations. So I can only assume that they have had that discussion, and that's the agreement that they've reached. And Lewis actually has said, I don't want to know, because I don't want to be disturbed by it.
Mark, I know you were quite critical of the strategy McLaren used with Lando. They've since said in hindsight, yeah, we should have brought him in with the VSC. But do you think at the time, looking back now, that was an option for them? Sorry, an option was to not come in. Do you think that was even a viable option even then at the time?
That there was an option to bring him in. I think there definitely was.
No. Do you think the option to keep him out, as they did you see that as a viable option? Because I think you were of the belief that they should have just brought him straight in, right?
So I made a mistake in not appreciating that. I thought he was still ahead of Oscar, in which case bringing him in would have been a no-brainer. But obviously they brought Oscar in, and that was a no-brainer. But it definitely was. It would have been a trade-off. It would have been about. He would have lost some time waiting for Oscar to clear the box, and it would have been trading off that time against the amount of time he's going to lose on track doing a full pit stop. And I think the difference between a safety car pit stop and a full pit stop was of the region of, I think it was around 6 or 7 seconds. So, and I guess also there was a feeling that that VSC may not last very long. So to be fair, I think it was a difficult choice that they had to make. Ultimately, it was the wrong choice, but I think in fairness to them on that occasion, it was a difficult one, and I think it was actually a reasonable choice that they made at the time. But I thought they'd missed a point. I thought they'd made a terrible blunder because I actually thought Lando was in front of Oscar, and for some reason they'd stopped Oscar and not Lando. So that was just me not understanding what had happened. I think Oscar got back ahead of him off screen, didn't he? Shortly after Lando had passed him. So yeah, that was my mistake really. So it was a difficult choice, and I think they made a fair choice, but ultimately it did prove to be the wrong one.
Mark, Hungary this weekend. What can fans expect there, and how do you see the strategies Pirelli bringing the soft tire as they would. It's going to be hot. It's a ribbon of grip there in Hungary, regardless of the resurfacing they do. How do you see that race, and what's your experiences in Hungary?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the circuit. I think the drivers enjoy certainly qualifying laps and driving the circuit. It's almost like a mini Silverstone in a way. The problem is that overtaking is really, really hard because of the nature of the track. There's not very long straights, even though they extended it many years ago. It still isn't long enough. It's quite twisty. It's quite high speed, a lot of it. Um, I've had a lot of success there with drivers. I mean, Mika won it twice, Kimi once, Heikki 2008 is his one victory there. So I've had good times there with Finnish drivers. In terms of what will happen, obviously from a power unit point of view, it will be much less of a problem because it's going to be energy rich, and because the full throttle time on a very short circuit or a shorter circuit is lower, then there will be less problems with that. So it will make it more of a driver and car, proper competition with less variability, hopefully from strange behaviour from power units. So that's good. In terms of the strategies, the teams will be desperate to make it one stop if they can, because of that problem of overtaking. So the more stops you do, the more problems that you have with the need to overtake. The surface that used to be years ago, it used to get very dusty between sessions because where the circuit is quite sandy and.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can
I'm
now.
back.
Yeah. There's just a slight internet glitch, I think.
Yeah. So I was saying it used to be very dusty, and even between sessions, the track used to get really dirty. And if you went out early in qualifying, you were at a massive disadvantage to cars that went out later in qualifying. So that used to be something you used to really take into account. They've done a much better job of cleaning the track between sessions recently, so that's been less of an issue. In terms of car performance, less emphasis on ultimate high-speed performance. So I have a feeling Max might be in better shape for this one because my feeling is that the Red Bull seems to have a very high-speed corner, not absolutely flat out, but corners that are almost flat out. It seems to struggle a little bit. We saw at Spa, even at Eau Rouge, he was having to, even though he's full throttle, the car was slowing down quite a lot at the apex, the first corner. For some reason, presumably it was just sliding around too much. So without those sorts of corners, or fewer of those sorts of corners, I think he might be stronger. It should be. I think it'll be much more of a normal event, and I think that's good. And just hopefully we'll get some incidents in the races. It'd be nice to have a bit of weather, wouldn't it, to spice things up a bit. We'll see how that goes. But it's an event I really liked. The city's great, nice place to go.
Yeah,
good place for a holiday if anyone fancies it.
Super chat here. If we can bring that up. Not sure what's working. Where are we? Anyway, it's from Debbie. Thank you very much, Debbie. Why does George Russell blame everything besides himself? He never says it's his fault. Well, I would say for the first time, he has said it was his fault. And we saw that in Spa, saying he's looking at his driving style. That's the way he called it. I think he's going to have a problem there because I don't believe if Kimi's doing a better job, which I think he is, turn time management, just generally the car in general and the road he uses, none of that stuff really is going to show up on telemetry, and you're going to see differences on telemetry, but they're just going to be the end result. They're not going to be what causes the end result, and it's going to be difficult for him at this stage to drive like Kimi, and he's better off probably being George Russell and just getting the best from himself at any given moment. But I think he has, for the first time, sort of dug quite deeply, and I don't ever remember George saying I need to work on my driving style ever at any stage of his career. So I think that's a bit of a breakthrough. Phil B4119, interesting point. He says track distances being wrong means software running the electrical power generation, release, and mechanical braking, electrical regeneration is getting false parameters to calculate the car's behavior? Question mark. It's a good point, actually. I mean, they're very precise. I mean, if there are some issues there, maybe it's it does affect things. Maybe we've hit on something here. Maybe Alice has hit on something quite significant. It might explain some of the software glitches that are going on inside the engines. What do you think, Mark?
Um, I doubt it, because it's relatively small uh, differences, and in fact, the teams use their own distances for most of what they're doing, and in fact, there is a variation lap to lap anyway, because that distance comes from wheel speed, and it's quite difficult to get an exact distance, because you've got rear wheels spinning under acceleration, front and rear wheels locking under braking. So it's quite difficult to get a precise lap distance anyway. What could be a factor is that the FIA are now specifying more and more sectors where the power delivery can be manipulated, and if those distances are wrong, or don't match what the car's doing, then I could imagine that starts to have some sort of bearing. But I would have thought the teams would be taking that into account as much as possible, by putting margins in. But maybe this is where we're having an issue. It's possible. I think it's relatively unlikely, but it is possible. Whereas in the past, it wouldn't have had an influence. So it comes down to complication. The more complicated you make things, so if you're starting to say you can do this with your power unit in this sector, this distance here, you're starting to introduce things that could go wrong.
Yeah.
And it's what should be avoided. Complication is almost always a bad thing.
Yeah.
The more simple things are, the better they work. So yeah, in conclusion, I think it's the teams normally don't use the FIA distance. It's not something that is used. They use their own car measurements of distance, but there is this issue of there being segments probably specified by distance that could start to become a bit of an issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and just going back to the introducing parts, of course, the worst thing you can do is introduce an additional movable aerodynamic part, which of course is what we're doing with Active Aero, which is why we keep banging on about Active Aero as well. Just as a general word, I'm going through the chat box. It's actually quite annoying from my perspective. There's a lot of chat amongst yourselves, some of which is quite distasteful. So far be it from me in any way to say what you should or shouldn't say. The reality is, I would much rather the chat box was used for proper questions to Mark or myself, and or comments about things we're saying, rather than having a go at one another about drivers or whatever that you disagree with. And it makes it much easier from my point of view, apart from anything else, to filter through the questions that are in any way valid. I hope that makes sense. Thank you very much. I just this one is a bit of a worry actually, because it shouldn't be the case, but it's from Hossein Sakibas saying, I'm struggling to find the join button, which may be disabled in my country. So if there's another way to join as a member, please let me know. What you're talking about is the little join tab below the video, which should be universally available, globally available to join as a member. I will check up on that. And if there is if there is any country where it is disabled, I'll let you know and what the other solution is to that. But thank you very much for mentioning that. The last thing we want are people who want to join as members and find that they can't. That's a real problem, obviously. So yeah, I think we're getting back to some proper questions. Max Flashart. Yeah, just talking about Mark's credentials. Actually, I probably tuned out when you were mentioning it, Mark. Have you actually won at Hungary?
Yeah, four races in Hungary.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a
And
serious result then. Very
yeah,
good.
Mika, what was it? Mika 99, 2000, Kimi 2005, which is probably the one I enjoyed most of all the wins, and Heikki's one and only win, sadly, in 2008. Yeah.
Very good. Congratulations. Yeah, I remember the Hecky win. That was mega, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
My main memories of Hungary, for what it's worth, are, well, many, but one of them was 91 when Ricardo stopped out on the circuit in the Williams FW14A around turn 3, 4, around there. And the car came back to the pits afterwards with no steering wheel on it. Patrick Head went absolutely ballistic, as you would, because those, I mean, that was effectively a prototype paddle shift steering wheel that I don't know how many man hours in the making, and I don't know how much it was actually in terms of cost. It was a lot of money. And anyway, you know, they took a long time to build and make those. We had a complete department at Williams, complete. We had 2 or 3 guys doing it, obviously. And I was TM at the time. So, and Patrick was, you know, you could see the steam coming out of his ears, as you would. And Ricardo had no idea or concept of what could have happened to the steering wheel. And actually, it's an interesting point. I think it was probably because of that the whole thing started, that the driver must put the steering wheel back on the column and make sure that, you know, the marshals can move the car around. And because Ricardo just took the wheel off, put it on the scuttle or whatever, and never saw it again. Anyway, I then went off to race control and explained what had happened. And they said, "Oh, well, you know, what do you want us to do about it?" And I said, "Well, you might want to let me look through all the CCTV if you have it, because we didn't have any video at that time. There was no proper coverage. This is at FP1, equivalent of FP1 anyway." And so I did. I sat down for about half an hour, went through all this grainy black and white footage, eventually find the bit where Ricardo stops. It was all over the place. And sure enough, you know, as he walks out of the car, Marshall sort of standing around the front of the car, and you just see him just quickly take the steering wheel and puts it in his bag. So sadly for that guy, we managed to find him and went back and got the wheel, and I think he was ejected from the circuit forthwith. That was my one thing. And the other thing, of course, was Nigel losing the 87 Hungarian Grand Prix, 5 laps to go with the right rear wheel nut coming off, leading the race easily. And of course, had he not made a pit stop to change tyres in the British Grand Prix, the race before, which he won, had he done the full race distance without that pit stop, probably we would have noticed then that the torque rates weren't quite enough for the right rear wheel, or for the loaded rear wheel. Well, for the rear axle anyway. And the way Nigel drove the car. And so that never showed up. And after that race, of course, we increased the torque rates on the nuts and everything was fine. But because he had the pit stop, there was no problem, because, you know, the nut, if it had been slightly loose at Silverstone, it was just retightened again in the pit stop. And as a result, it worked his way loose in the Hungarian Grand Prix. Just goes to show, doesn't it? Not quite sure what it goes to show. It just goes to show that if you win a race, you lose another, I suppose. But have you had any experiences like that, Mark?
On me, sorry, got a frog in my throat. Bless me. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I think what it shows is just the level of detail that goes into it and how difficult it is to win races. I don't think people understand how much effort, how many things have to go right to win a race. It's absolutely incredible. We had a wheel nut came off Mika's car at Silverstone in '99. That cost him that race. Funnily enough, we had when was it? There was the wet race at Indianapolis. I guess that was 2003, was it? Kimi finished second, which was a fantastic result given that the Michelin wet tyres weren't very good at that time. And after the race, we couldn't get the wheel off the car.
Really?
So it was a good job that we hadn't had to do another pit stop, because we couldn't get the wheel off. I think we had to cut the nut off in the end.
Really?
Yeah, that was a huge problem.
Wow.
But yeah, and then we've had other races where you have a wheel that's not been prepped properly, and you've got the paint on the cone. And that stops although the wheel tightens up properly, because you've got the paint between the nut and the wheel. Eventually it works loose. We've had that happen. I think that happened at Renault once. Yeah, all these tiny little things that can completely have you over, even if you've got the best power unit, the best driver, the best sponsors, the best car, best designers. Yeah, something tiny
Yeah.
like that goes wrong.
And just thinking that through, what you were saying, it's quite interesting that when I joined Williams in as team manager, rejoined them in 91, end of 90, one of the things that I was briefed to work on straight away by Patrick was to improve our pit stops, because they were sort of consistently 2 to 3 seconds slower than Benetton and Ferrari. And talking to Dickie Stamford and the boys, the problem was guess what? The torque rates on the rear wheels and how long they had to keep the nuts on the rear wheels. And so then we had to go the other way and back away. And that's when I sent, I think it was John Russell, down to Nigel Mansell's Ferrari dealership in Somerset with a micrometer to look at the back of the John Barnard Ferrari to see exactly how the rear suspension was laid out. And for sure, Patrick, even today, would be livid if he heard about that. Hopefully he's in Sardinia or on a yacht, not listening. And just to see how that rear suspension and the uprights and everything came together, and how they were able to run lower torque rates on the rear nuts and have the faster pit stops. And we did that and eventually improved as a result. There you go. Right. Better not go down that path any longer. Having a great relationship with Patrick, as I do. McLaren will have the Macarena wing in Hungary. Okay, good. Well, there's another moving part to go wrong. I hope it doesn't go wrong for them, is all I can say. Because, you know, I don't know. What do you think about those rear wings? I think after the issues we've had with them, Lewis, and with, obviously Max, I don't think they should be allowed in Formula One. That's my view. Mark, what do you reckon about those wings?
They need the moving aero to avoid the energy problems being much, much, much worse. You know, the cars have to lose drag, otherwise they just don't have enough power. The issue is the reattachment of the flow, which obviously Ferrari seemed to have got on top of, Red Bull didn't get on top of, and McLaren will be wondering if they're on top of, because until they run the car, they won't know whether
No
they've got a
testing.
problem with that or not. No, exactly. So that is going to be interesting. And they could have a problem with it, and they may not. But in terms of how do you ban it, well, you know, the trouble is that problem even existed with the DRS wings. So you can't ban the ones that flip over all the way, because that doesn't necessarily fix the problem. You could invent, a non-flipping over flat that still has that same problem. So it is fundamentally the problem of having moving aerodynamics. And you could say, so even DRS cars, as I said, still had potentially that problem. But what would happen then is that basically we used to identify where the issue was, and they would develop, obviously, to fix it, because you're losing lap time if you're not using that element. And the drivers have an override, but it's still potentially unsafe. So ban moving aero, which this has been banned moving aero is actually already a rule, but they've made an exception for this. The cars would just run out of energy. So it all comes back to the same problem, doesn't it?
It's interesting they're bringing it for Hungary, and this is probably my skeptical mind, but I wonder whether it's because if something does go wrong, it's Hungary. It's not quite the same as something going wrong at Spa. I wonder if there's some thinking along those lines.
I suspect it's just more to do with development time and the fact that it will be the wing they run at almost all other events, whereas as we discussed, there was actually the first time this year where people were running specific low downforce rear wings at Spa. So different elements of them probably, they may use them in Monza, but they may not use them anywhere else. So for McLaren to develop a wing specifically for Spa and Monza probably didn't make sense. So I imagine it's more to do with the fact that it's going to be a wing they use everywhere else, and probably not related to issues like that, I would think.
What about Saudi Arabia? Do you think they would use it? How do you see Saudi Arabia in terms of pace?
Yeah, it could be a wing where you use the low downforce wing could be used there, but I think it was just that early in the season they were concentrating on other developments, and so they didn't have time to focus on that sort of thing. And I'm talking about all the teams really. So obviously at some point they go, okay, in terms of performance per pound spent, a low downforce rear wing becomes the thing to do for Spa when it wasn't the thing to do earlier in the season, when there were other things that gave more performance that were worth spending the money on. And at some point the team has to go, right, how much have we spent on damaged parts? How much have we spent on new power units? Oh, we've got some money left over. Okay, we can push the button on that rear wing for Spa that we thought we may not make.
Yeah.
That's how it tends to work, I think.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for that. Let's just have a look at some other questions. Lots of people using capital letters too. Kind of, whoa. Yeah, I know. I think we should just all say upper and lowercase, please. Capital letters, but then lowercase otherwise. Yep. As my best editors always used to say. Will Hildebrand says, great chat, gentlemen. I think being land pilots is hard. Asking the drivers to be electricians during the race is a bridge too far. Well said. Well said.
Well, they're not even being asked to be electricians, though, are they? Because they don't actually have an influence on what's going on.
Yeah.
It's
well, that's right, and that's our complaint, and and B, the lack of understanding of what it's all about anyway.
But let's face it, there are two rules on there. There's cars should have no moving aero parts. They've made an exception for that. And the cars should be driven solely by the drivers with no outside intervention. And yet we've got computers on board that are deciding how much power should be delivered. Because if they didn't, the cars would run out of power. So they've written rules to make it a good sport, and then they're putting in exceptions.
Okay, let me ask you this then, Mark. In the era prior to pits to car changes being banned, in other words, when DC won Monaco and they were just adjusting the engine mixtures, I think, from the garage, and then they said no, Max basically said no, we can't have that, the drivers have got to be in control, and that's when it became illegal to do that. You could only do it when they go through the start finish line and get the telemetry every lap, correct?
Well, years ago it used to be that you could send signals to the cars.
Okay, right. Now it's only from the car to the garage, right? Oops, lost you again.
Banned.
Yeah,
and all we get now is data from the track, from the car on the track back to the garage.
Yeah, okay,
right. And the only thing that goes to the car is the radio now.
Yeah. But my question is, if you look at the total amount of data now that the car is using from the garage, if that's in inverted commas, is it actually more now than it was before they did before they banned everything? If you include the way that the engine is being managed now.
The difference now is that onboard computational processes are happening, which are now making decisions. So it's out of the control of the garage and of the driver. So the car is developing a brain and making choices. So that, how do you stop that is a question.
Well, is that AI then in effect?
It could be. But computers make decisions, don't they, based on inputs and zeros and ones, and that is developing at a high rate. So it's been the case for some time. I think I mentioned this even last year, that the power delivery is affected by the learning from previous laps. So the computer adapts, the engine control adapts the power delivery based on what it learns from previous laps, and then the teams have to set parameters such that in qualifying, out laps, in laps, slow laps don't count, so that learning isn't confused. And in a race, there will be some laps, if a driver goes off, that lap will be discarded within a certain range. But there were still issues where drivers would slow down a bit to save fuel, maybe, and that would confuse, because the amount of lap time would go down by a small amount, but not a huge amount. And then you get the engine guy would be coming on there, tell them to stop doing that because that's confusing the learning. So it's a huge can of worms, and I struggle to see how that can be stopped, really.
But just to pursue that point, what is the red line between computational analysis and the use of AI? And is the use of AI in that illegal anyway in Formula One? Is there anything about AI in the regulations, I wonder?
I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think so. And I would imagine that learning that is going on and has done for a number of years now. I don't know how you define where AI starts and doesn't, but I would have thought it might come under that category. Machine learning.
Pretty scary, isn't it?
Yeah. Again, I think it becomes scary when we don't understand what it's doing. If it could be demonstrated what is happening, then I wouldn't have such a big problem with it, because I'd understand what's going on. It's the not understanding what's going on that really pisses me off.
Yeah,
frankly.
And it's not just, we're not talking about you, Mark Slade, engineer now. We're talking about the teams, quite clearly.
But it seems to be, yeah. They seem to be struggling. But as a fan, I want to know, as a fan watching races, why what's happening in front of me is happening. I want to know where the difference in driver performance, car performance, I want to know what those factors are. That's what makes it exciting to me.
I've just put another question up there from Addy Boy. If a software is dictating the battery deployment instead of the driver, wouldn't that count as a driver assist and therefore should be banned? And that's coming to the nub of the problem, isn't it, really?
Yeah, but as I'm saying, that's the exception that's been made. As
sorry, got an internet glitch again.
Yeah,
sorry. That's the exception that's been made. Yeah,
an exception has been made, and I think incorrectly, as the exception has been made for moving aerodynamic parts. But these are all things that have been done because we've got these hybrid engines that don't have enough electrical energy storage and recovery for the power output that's been specified. So, the rules were made hopefully for good reasons, and the exceptions are now being made to manipulate it to give a result. But that result is we're losing control of the result because it's adding extra elements of confusion and complexity into it.
Yep. Max says, make drivers push buttons again. Right. Just going to go down to a few more. We're going to wind it up pretty soon. But where are we? Green Misty says drivers will lose their OBS to AI. Yeah, okay. Sony uses bots to penalize users. I mean, we're going down a very, weird path, I think, of Formula One right now. And the more we go down this electric path, the worse it's going to get. And the best we can hope for in reality, despite the make corners great again and bring back V8 t-shirts that you can all buy on our merch store, it's going to be 60-40 most likely, and that's still nothing like enough, Mark, right? And I think
yeah, so it's a long way from being enough, and I don't think it's even 60-40, is it, for next year?
No, I'm talking about by 2028, 60-40.
Yeah.
I mean, next year it's nothing really.
No, 60-40 won't be enough. It's 80-20 was okay. Maybe you could get to 75-25 and it'd be just about okay. But if it comes down to the 1,000 horsepower, if you brought that down, if you made it 700 horsepower, then possibly you could do 60/40, but then the cars would be a lot slower. And it's just targets that are not achievable without causing big problems. But the problem they've got now is the teams have rightly pointed out that if they change it to 70/30 for next year, then their fuel tanks in the cars aren't big enough to put all the fuel in. And it's going to cost them a fortune to make a new chassis, redesign the car, when they were told that it wouldn't be changing, so their plans don't include new chassis for next year. It's all these knock-on problems.
Yeah, but isn't that the moment when the commercial rights holder stroke the FIA would say, well, we made a mistake, so in this occasion we're going to subsidize those changes and we're going to release the budget cap in order to make those changes because we need to do it to make the racing better and to take Formula One back to where it should be? Isn't that what should happen?
Well, if they just said we'll release the cost cap so you can spend more, then the teams that don't have enough money, like Haas, would
Yeah,
go,
but as I
well,
say, that they should then subsidize it. All the teams should get a subsidized bonus to do that specifically. The same amount of money. Wouldn't that work?
Well, yes, but who's going to pay for it? They don't want to pay for it, do they?
Really? Aren't they making lots of money? We're told there's unbelievable growth of Formula One at the moment.
Yeah, but then there's just going to be a massive squabble about whose money it is and who.
Yeah. It's Formula One's money, by which I mean the teams and a few others.
It's not. They would say, well, it's not our fault, although it partly is.
Well, it's all their fault, isn't it?
Yeah. Again, you have to come to an agreement, don't you? And getting people to agree to spend more money on things they don't want to spend money on is so hard. It would take 2 or 3 years to get to an agreement.
You know who's laughing at all this? Bernie. Because when you just said we'll take an agreement, Bernie would have looked across to whoever he was with at that moment and said, that's why we never had agreements. That's why when I wanted to get something through that was the right thing, and I knew all the teams would never approve it, I would put it in last on the list and I would wrap it up in something else. They'd all be going off to get their flight back to Milan or Zurich. And they'd all say, yeah, Bernie. And then he'd come back and they'd make the change. That's how you do it. All this agreement stuff. What's all this agreement? What do they know about it? Isn't that what would have happened? Isn't that what did happen?
Yeah.
And that's why, I think more and more we realize how much we miss Bernie. It's incredible, isn't it, to say that? I mean, a lot of people out there, oh, what are you on about, Windsor? But Bernie would never in a million years have allowed this to happen to Formula One, in my opinion. He did make a lot of mistakes, the biggest of which was to sell the rights in the first place rather than keeping them. But having made that mistake, he then did a pretty good job of retaining the running of the sport for a reasonable amount of time. But ever since he's let go or been forced to let go, look, there's too many committees, too many agreements, and too much compromise. And here we are.
Yeah, it's the lack of focus on what the objective is, and
what do you think Bernie would say if somebody said to Bernie, "Yeah, but Bernie, we've got Cadillac and Audi in the sport now. Doesn't matter, we've got them in the sport."
He wouldn't care about them, would he? I don't think, unless they were giving him a huge amount of money, of course.
Which I don't think they would be specifically.
But it's the classic. It's just become a big, complicated beast with too many vested interests, and you need one powerful person with the right intentions, ideally, calling the shots.
Well,
but we don't.
If I can just interrupt and say, with the right intentions and with the right view, because it's very easy to view the sport from 50, 30, 25, 5,000 feet, but you need somebody who can look at that all together and takes the proper view in terms of the medium and long term, and indeed from where the sport has come and what it's all about and where it's going. And I think you and I have always been in agreement that yes, the Netflix concept is a brilliant concept going behind the scenes, but it's not the only game in town. And there's so much more to the show right now that could be put out there for Netflix too, if you like. And right now, for example, all the issues behind the scenes about these regulations, how Honda are fighting the situation they're in, how Aston Martin and Adrian are fighting it. I know that, probably we're going to see all that 2 or 3 years down the road, but we should be seeing it now. This is Formula One's live animal, breathing, sleeping, eating, and we should be nurturing it and looking after it rather than controlling it and putting band-aids everywhere every time something goes wrong. There's a lot of show out there that we're not seeing.
Yeah, and it's kind of the point I was trying to make earlier, is that the thing that broke Formula One was the access to the background. But I think because of the
When you say
mess
broke,
that,
you mean made it.
yeah,
Yeah.
that made it, as in, it's suddenly become a much more valuable, successful business. But the thing that made that was the background access, and because of the mess we've got ourselves into with these power units and not wanting to admit that, they're actually going to probably be preventing that access from occurring. So they're actually working against the very thing that made it successful. In my opinion, the fact that the graphics don't appear, that the cameras cut away when it gets a bit embarrassing, that is working against the very thing that made it so successful in the last few years.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable, the lack of understanding of that.
Yeah. I mean, if you wanted a template of how to move forward in Formula One, it was always 2021, reproduce 2021, reproduce 2021. It doesn't get any better than that. And yet they didn't. They just said, oh no, let's come up with a complete new engine formula that destroys everything and we start again.
Yeah.
With Audi and Cadillac.
Yeah.
And without Renault.
Yeah.
It's very
completely
sad.
agree. 2021 was, until the last lap of the last race, was the best season of Formula One I'd ever experienced.
Yeah. And and how do you repeat that? Well, basically, you don't change anything. Isn't that the logical thing? And you just keep going within reason in terms of going a little bit greener here, a little bit greener there, saving a little bit of money here, maybe doing this, doing that, improving the TV. But generally, you just keep things as it is. It's working, and yet they didn't do that.
Evolution, not revolution, tends to be the way.
Very good. Very good last words there, Mark. Thank you so much for your time, buddy. And no doubt we'll be WhatsApping during the Hungarian Grand Prix. Let's hope I'm sure it'll be a half reasonable race for the reasons we know. Yeah, it's an energy-rich circuit, and Max and Red Bull should be in there, throwing their weight around a little bit. And obviously Mercedes will be good. Ferrari shouldn't be bad there either, and McLaren should be right up there. So it should be a pretty good race,
It should.
We don't have any doubt about that. Well, in theory, we don't have any doubt about it. Anyway, big thanks to you. Thanks to the viewers too for watching, and looking forward to seeing you all over the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the usual videos, and we'll be doing the live chat during the race. So assuming you can make that join tab work, and let's hope it is working, please join us as a channel member if you'd like to. You can be a part of the live race chat, which is brilliant for me because I learn a lot from you guys with everything that's going on. And then after Hungary, we go into the 3-week break. I say 3 weeks, it's 3 weeks for the next race. It's the August break. And we'll be doing quite a lot of good, hopefully good stuff for channel members as well in that period too. So looking forward to opening my desk folder for some various videos during that period, probably live as well. So thanks for watching. Thanks for the questions and answers. Remember, in the future, let's just keep them to comments directed to Mark and to me and Mark and our other guests, and keep it clean. Looking forward to seeing you soon. Take care.